And I'm delighted to be joined today by our speaker, Matt Ellison. And a brief history of Matt. He has specialized in cybersecurity for over 15 years across endpoint, network, and user technologies, and has led teams in product management, product marketing, and technical sales. With previous roles at Symantec, Logarithm, and BAE Systems, Matt's extensive experience has allowed him to work with numerous organizations across EMEA and APAC, helping them understand how best to address their security challenges. Matt, over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rob. Very much appreciated, and great to be on the call today. And thank you all for joining. Fantastic to have you here for another webinar in our monthly series. For those of you that are here from one that you've attended previously, great to have you back. Thank you for coming. And for those of you that are new to these webinars, great to have you with us. I hope this is useful for you today, and look forward to you attending more of our webinars in the future. So we're going to start off today talking about 5 of the key elements of hunt readiness. So obviously, as you've gathered, you're here seeing the title of this webinar, and today we're going to be talking about really how to get your security operations team pivoting towards more of a kind of threat hunting approach. And we're going to discuss some of the differences between what you might be doing now and how you can get to threat hunting, and a variety of different ways to achieve that. So we're going to cover that across these 5 different areas. The first one, as you can see there on the screen, is the data. Obviously very important and very relevant, and we'll dig into that one first. Secondly, we're going to talk about people and process. So obviously without these 2, then the first one is pretty pointless. Great to have all that data, but you need the people and the processes to actually be able to do something with it. Then we'll talk about the tools. Again, very important. You can't really do any of this without having those tools in place, but we'll dig into that a little bit further. And then we start to get things that we see and hear a lot about, and we know are really important. So threat intel, a big part of SOCs these days, and analysts working with that information. Yeah, we'll dig into that one too. And then finally, we'll just briefly touch on automation and the relevance that that has. We're not going to dig deep into automation today. That's going to be a topic for another day. But automation is something that I think we've talked about as an industry for a long time. And we've all heard about SOAR solutions, and almost every major security vendor has some kind of component of either working with automation or providing automation. But it's probably one of those that people have shied away from. So yeah, we'll discuss some of that too. So I want to start with this quote here from Rob Joyce. So Rob Joyce was the former chief of Tailored Access Operations at the NSA, or TAO, as you may hear it referred to. So this is the team in the NSA that effectively dug into the networks of, places that the NSA wanted to look into. So I guess we don't need to get into the details. Yeah, they'd find their way into networks using the same techniques as maybe hackers. So yeah, nation state hacking, let's put it that way. But he made this comment that when he was at the NSA, one of their worst nightmares is that out-of-band network tap that really is capturing all of the data, understanding anomalous behavior that's going on, and someone is paying attention to it. You've got to know your network, understand your network, because we're going to. So on the face of it, that sounds okay, great. They were worried when they were hacking into these networks. They were worried that somebody was there with an out-of-band network tap that was capturing all of the data that was going backwards and forwards in that network, that they were understanding anomalous behavior that didn't look right, and that they were actually paying attention to it because they knew their network. And that effectively is what we're going to be talking about today. For those of you that aren't aware, Corelight is an out-of-band network tap. We capture all of the data, everything that's happening, all of those network packets and those connections, how they all relate to each other. And that allows you as an organization to understand that anomalous behavior. And probably more importantly, it makes it much easier to pay attention to that data because the validity of it, the way that data is presented, is much easier to manipulate. And then it allows you to know your network better. So that's really what we are absolutely trying to present. Okay, so as mentioned, let's start with the data. So when you're beginning with this process of moving from detection-based security to a threat hunting type approach, when you're starting out, you're going to have ad hoc visibility. So what we mean by that is that you may or may be collecting data related to your network. So maybe you're pulling in your Windows logs or your endpoint logs into a SIEM, or you're working directly within a tool that collects that data, and you're getting an insight into those network connections. You can see information that's being captured from maybe DNS logs or HTTP, those kind of things, where you're understanding that endpoints are making connections out to hosts. Maybe you've got NetFlow traffic that's telling you what's moving backwards and forwards in the network at a very high level. But typically, it's going to be spotty. You're not going to get the detail. It's maybe not going to be particularly clean. You've got things in different formats. It's called a host IP address in one place, and it's just called IP address in another place. So it's not easy necessarily to match it all up. And potentially it's not even structured. It's just raw data that's being captured and stored in flat files or PCAPs. So it's things where that data needs to be extracted for you to be able to work with it. And then as a result of that, you have what we call many data puddles. So, different to the data lakes that we all hear about, where all of that data is put into a central location and can all be related. This is lots of different separate locations where you're looking for that information and trying to pull it all together. And that's pretty normal. That's what most organizations are dealing with today. That's where we're kind of at with these bits and pieces. But for those organizations that want to move forward, that really want to start digging into that threat hunting, you get that kind of intermediate stage where you've said, okay, we want to move forward with threat hunting. There's an approach that we need to take, and we need to fix things as a result. So how do we go about that? So the first thing is you get what we call instrumented visibility. So what we mean there is that you're taking these tools, it's more than just a raw log. You're processing it, you're taking the information, and you're doing something with it. You're using it and putting the data into something in a way that you can start to compare and contrast and measure and actually make use of. So as a result, this data is now comprehensive. It's much cleaner, more structured to compare it to the beginning approach. And of course, that data is now mostly centralized. Naturally, for most organizations, that means you're putting it in a SIEM solution of some description, but it doesn't have to be that. Maybe it's all going into some kind of just a central location, a data lake, however you want to put it and describe it. But in most cases, it is going to be a SIEM of some description. There may be some bits and pieces that don't quite go in there for a variety of reasons. So maybe it's the volume of data that's generated versus the value of the data. So something like syslog might be an example of something that you can get very high volumes, but in some cases putting that into your SIEM is actually quite an expensive process. So it's maybe better to keep that in a flat file somewhere, just an example. So moving past that again, we start to get towards the advanced stage. Now, this is where people have capitalized on that intermediate stage, and obviously they're taking it to the next step, the next level of working with that data. So at this point, it's architected visibility. So what we mean by that is that you're consciously choosing the structures that the data is going to come in. You're working with that data, or indeed that you're working with vendors that provide the data in a format that's logical so you can ingest it and work with it. The data is complete. You have everything that you need from all of the different parts of your network and your endpoints to be able to tie everything together and understand how it all relates. So, how do you match your network data to your endpoint data beyond just kind of pivoting around timestamps and things like that, making data naturally more integrated and more relevant. Of course, you're now at the point where that data is fully complete, it's clean, it's structured. You know where it's going into the seam or whichever data lake you're choosing to use, whatever approach you're choosing to use. But it's all there, it's all relevant, and you can work with it. So those are the kind of stages that we're talking about when it all relates to data and that validity and the importance of that data coming in. And I appreciate that on the face of it, this all seems pretty obvious. It's that approach of, I get it. I've got stuff that's messy and all over the place. If I'm going to make sense of it, if I'm going to start working with it, and I'm going to actually deliver something that's of value, then of course I need to get that data tidied up and clean and in a central location. And we do, of course, understand that that can actually be pretty hard work. And potentially, there's costs and things attached to that. Putting more and more data into your seam can get expensive. Putting everything in there would get really expensive. So that's why we're talking about the value of that data, what you do with it, and making sure it's the right data and that it's the complete data. Because it's what's important. And this will become clear as we progress further as to what we really mean by those different stages. Okay, so let's talk about that instrumented data versus ad hoc. So what you can see there on the screen is an example of a typical DNS server log. It's a bunch of stuff, but if you break it down, you can see there's some information in there. There's a timestamp, there's some IP addresses, and there's some bits of text that give us an insight into what's actually happening. Now, when we structure that data for going into a seam, we typically break it down. For those of you that are used to this sort of thing, mostly we'll see this in a JSON type format where it's pairs of data, and as you can see, it's stacked up there. We've got the event time, we've got the category, the severity, yada yada yada. So we get all of that information, and that's fantastic. It's some really good, interesting data that we can put into our seam. But then as we progress that data and we start to talk about tools like Corelight, where you're getting a much greater degree of information, then we start to move more towards the kind of instrumented data approach. So that's where we're digging in much further, and we're actually working with the data before we go and put it in the seam. So you're getting a much richer degree of data that you can make more use of. So there's the same kind of things that you're going to see. We've got the timestamp, we've got some of those IP addresses in there, but you can see how we've enriched that data. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is that the green that you can see at the top, the UID. So that's something that we calculate for all of the different traffic that we see across the network. So if you compare that back to your old DNS log, it just told you what was in that DNS information. It just told you there was a query for example.com from this particular IP address. The richness of the data that we're providing here as we head towards that intermediate stage and that kind of advanced stage, that's where we're adding these extra layers of information that help you make much more value of that data. So you might say, okay, well, what's that UID? Why is that important? Why is that relevant? Well, that's a unique identifier for that particular connection. It tells us everything about what went back and forth. So the fact is that it's not just the information from the DNS packet, but as you can see there in the blue, we're getting that information of the original host that made the request, the port number that it went on, And then the responding host that gave the response, the protocol. We're getting the round trip time, and then we get some of the same information, but then we get much more detailed information in terms of the answers that came back, so we can see exactly what was transmitted. So that's all great. We've got this much richer record. It's got more information on it, and it's got some fields that are not provided when you're just using the default DNS log. So let's take a step further and let's understand why that's actually important and why that's relevant, and why moving from that beginner to that intermediate and advanced stage is so important in allowing analysts to work with this data and to actually dig deeper and get more information out. So we'll look at that momentarily. So with the next steps, start with a good enough asset inventory. So one of the things that that's really important here is understanding what you have in your network. And obviously there's a number of different ways that you can do this. Again, Corelight has its own built-in asset detection. So that's some of the tools that you could use. Maybe you could use your Epic tool. Then you know the devices that your kind of endpoints installed. You obviously can use NetFlow to understand what's talking to what and relate that back. A number of different ways you can do that, but start with a good enough asset inventory to be able to understand that data. What's normal is relative. One of the things that we often talk to folks about is when they start to talk about AI and machine learning and automated systems that you can just plug into your network and it learns what normal is, what the default behaviors on your network are. And that's great to have a tool that does that, and they can bring real value and can really help with those detections and understanding what's going on in the network. But bear in mind that nothing beats your knowledge of the network. As a security analyst, as somebody that's part of the security team or the IT team or the networking team, you know the quirks of your network. You know the things that are weird, you know the things that are important, and you know the things that really add value. So an automated solution is never going to do a great job of learning that. So always bear that in mind and always think about how you can apply that knowledge and that experience to what you're seeing and what you're searching for across the network. And the network is always going to be the fastest way to get that wide aperture visibility, to see everything that's going on, going backwards and forwards. There's any kind of attack within your organization has to traverse the network. There's really no other way you can do it unless somebody's obviously got direct access to exactly what they want on the particular server that they want locally. Then that's a different story. But in most cases, that network is going to give you that insight. But understanding everything that's going on in the network is a great way to get that visibility. Your assets and the compromises that happen on those assets, that's on the endpoints. So again, getting to and from those endpoints, that's going to happen on the network. So understanding your endpoints, as we say there, the asset inventory, the things that are unusual, the things that are quirky, the things that are important, that's all interrelated. And then finally, as you move with that data towards those different stages, it's really good to talk to your vendors, to work with your vendors, and ensure that they understand how you're ingesting data and that they are able to deal with that. And not everybody is the same. There's obviously some commonalities that we all see, you know, the formats of how logs are ingested and all that kind of stuff. But what you want to be avoiding is ETL or extract, transform, and load. You don't want to be pulling data out of one solution, having to work with it, change it, and then put it into another wherever that can be helped. Some cases you can't avoid it, but anything that smooths the transition of data between one place to the other and makes it efficient and effective in how you can, the speed with which you can start working with it, that obviously really helps you get from that beginning stage to that advanced stage. Anything that smooths that path is going to be a really good thing to help you move along. Okay, so let's do the same for people and process. So we understand now with the data, yep, great, we get it. We start off with very rough data from lots of different places, and we then end up with a very smooth instrumented data where things are being delivered in a much cleaner format. We understand that. But the people and the processes that you have in place have to match that approach. You can't have one without the other. You can't get to that stage without people also working alongside. So when you start off, threat hunting tends to be a job function if it's being done at all. So you'll say to an analyst, hey, part of your job will be hunting for anomalies. And the success will be judged when you find something that's weird or a compromise or something that's going on within the network that is a true positive. It's something that shouldn't be happening. Somebody's got access in, or even it's just something internal that's unusual. Somebody using a self-signed certificate because they've gone off and done their own little project, or they've installed a piece of software that has a weak cipher. All of those kind of things that you can find when you're searching, and you've got that data in place, but you're now finding it as an analyst. So that's a great starting point. The fact here is that you've made a conscious decision that instead of just responding to alerts that are generated in the tools that you already have, you're actually going to do threat hunting. Now, of course, just to reiterate here, when we're talking about hunting, what we mean there is that rather than just responding to detections that have been turned on in the catalog, you're actually responding to, or you've set up your detections so that they are correct for your environment. They're based on your environment, the hardware that you have in place, the tools that you have in place, and you're searching for things that are anomalous to your network and how you know your network is set up. So that's what we mean by threat hunting. It's not just, hey, I'm just working through lists of false positives that I know are just being generated by crazy because we've got everything in the alert catalog turned on. So as we move to that intermediate stage, this is where threat hunting moves from being a part of a job to the job. So the job is that day to day, you are coming in, you're working through detections that are based on a thesis that you have, potentially just for that day. These aren't going to be things that you're automatically searching for all day, every day. It might be something where, hey, today I'm going to look at the traffic between these two devices, and there shouldn't be any of this type of traffic, so I'm going to look for it. You're also hunting for techniques. So you're looking for more subtle things that aren't necessarily going to be detected by an automatic process. They're things that you're going to be looking for. If you were to set up an automated process, it would probably cause a lot of false positives. So on this occasion, you're digging in, you're looking through, you're working for something, and you evaluate that success accordingly. You're going to have different measures for how that success is evaluated based on your own organization and how everything fits together. And then when you move beyond that, so when we talk about the elite threat hunting organizations that do this day in, day out with their very large security teams because it's imperative, you're hunting as a team. So not just is it a role that one person is doing, but everybody's in agreement, everybody's working towards the same goals. You're able to hand off and hand over. You're hunting for adversaries, and we're going to dig into this a little bit more later and the relevance of that. And the success is measured. So you have proper processes and measures in place to understand how that success is measured. So it's not going to be a straightforward, hey, we found X number of things, or we had X number of detections come through, or there's this many detections on the board and we need to clear them down. It's much more meaningful detections that are relevant to the hunting that you're doing. So tying up those two things together, the talking about the data and the value and the relevance of that data, and then wrapping the people and the processes around it. So you're heading towards that full threat hunting. This is just a very simple example of how that starts to come into play, and how that more valuable data really allows you to work more effectively. So what we have here is a query that is looking for something pretty straightforward, but a DNS response that's over a certain length. So as you can see there, that's the query taken from Splunk. Pretty straightforward, but yeah, if we've got a DNS query length where the response that comes back is over 25 characters. So we go off and we do that search, and that's great. We get the response back. And we can see here that there is a particular host which is very chatty. In fact, compared to the others, I appreciate it's a limited list there, but it's got over 13,000 DNS responses that are over 25 characters in length. Now, I'm sure you can all gather where we're heading with that. It clearly looks like DNS exfiltration, but what you'll see on that left-hand side there is that we have the UID listed. Now, we mentioned earlier about the value of that data and how moving to that instrumented data and adding more valuable fields, such as the UID that's relevant to the connection. Well, that's very interesting. That's a unique ID that says that all 13,215 DNS responses were all between the same host and were all part of the same conversation. So that's a really useful piece of information. So we can take that UID and we can then pivot on that UID and actually look at exactly what was in there. As we can see from these records down below, it's a whole bunch of nonsensical queries. So those are the classic traits of DNS exfiltration. But that's data that we wouldn't necessarily have been able to find as quickly or as easily without that unique ID and without being able to tie those two together. So again, that approach of increasing the value of the data, bringing that data together, combining it with a threat hunting mentality that says, well, I'm not just going to have a detection for this, I'm going to actively go out and search for it. And of course, you can have detection for this in place, and I'm sure everybody does. It's a very simplistic detection, but it just gives you that idea of how, if a response comes back, you're seeing these kind of very high level things, how you can take that data, dig deeper into it, and understand exactly what's going on. Now, of course, depending on how that data was extracted, base 64 encoding, something like that, then potentially you can unwrap what the actual data was that was exfiltrated, understand more. But not only that, you've got a whole bunch of extra information that you can start to make use of, which we won't get into today, unfortunately. So when we talk about those detections, when we talk about where we go with this kind of data and how it sort of works, a great starting point is obviously MITRE. Now, I'm sure everybody on this call is fully aware, you've dug into MITRE.org, you're aware of how all of this works. But just as a pointer, you can start with the matrices, a whole bunch of really useful detections there. And these detections can form the information that's in the matrix can form the kind of the thesis for the detections and the threat hunting that you would want to carry out when you are starting to move towards this kind of approach. So those on the left-hand side, they tend to be endpoint favorable. So all the way up to credential access. Best way to find those is typically via your endpoint tool. So really useful. The ones on the right-hand side, they tend to be network favorable. But of course, again, covering it, as you start to match up that data, then you start to bring those two things together, and the way they tie in and they work with one another starts to become much more impactful. So when we're talking about people and processes, what are those next steps? Firstly, if you don't already have it, then add that hunting skill set as a role. Think about who those people could be within your organization. If that seems a step too far, then just carve it out as a specific part of the day within your existing role. Just say, okay, every day I'm going to spend 2 hours a day threat hunting, and dig into what that means for your your organization? Does it mean building specific queries? Does it mean just doing a paper-based exercise with your colleagues around the kind of things that you could be looking for? Does it even just mean learning the quirks of your network a bit better, understanding what the roles of different servers do and how they all interact? It's amazing how often we talk to an IT team who knows what all the servers do, because that's their responsibility, networking team that just fully understands how the network functions and how everything links together, and then the security team that kind of looks at the security of everything and what's happening, but doesn't necessarily know the ins and outs of the two different aspects. So maybe it's just understanding more. But all of those steps, as we've highlighted, are going to get you further down that road to get to those advanced stages. As that starts to grow, then you can start to augment with data science backgrounds. So digging more into how do we build those really effective queries? How do we make use of this more complete, more enriched data? How do we build the SOC dashboards? How do we build stuff in our SIEM? All of that kind of approach. To make the best of it, then those kind of skills are going to really start coming into play. Third one there, have a goal of doing specific and scheduled hunts. Great approach, digging in deeper and thinking a lot more about what you're doing rather than just being a slave to the alert engine where you're just responding to those detections that are coming in regardless. And then, yeah, collaborate across other cybersecurity teams, other people from similar industries. All of that kind of stuff. There's lots of ways that you can interact and collaborate with other teams that are doing the same thing. Just a couple of links there at the bottom. We produced a threat hunting guide to help you make those steps to understanding and being much more effective. And then we also have some free Sigma rules that you can use for threat hunting. So both two really useful resources. So please do go and get hold of those. Let's dig into the tools. So this is one of those areas that seems pretty obvious, and we'll cover it pretty quickly. A good starting point, if you're not doing it already, look at some of the free and open source software. There's some really good stuff, obviously from our side. At Corelight, we're going to push Zeek, but there are other ways that you can do those things. Lots of different solutions that you can have in place that allow you to start working with this more enriched data from specifically your network in this case. Moving towards an intermediate stage, you've got those more commercial, off-the-shelf kind of tools. So you will all have plenty of those tools in place already, whether it's endpoint, whether it's network, whether it's a SIEM, but all kinds of different bits and pieces. But this is where we're moving to that stage of the quality of the data, the validity of the data is greatly improved. You're bringing it together into some kind of SIEM or aggregator so that you can start to work with disparate data sources. And that's effectiveness of how you start to get going and tying it in with the other approaches. Clearly, all of these things are interrelated. You're not going to be able to do one without the other. Or it's going to be certainly a lot more challenging to be able to do one without the other. And then at the advanced stage, so this is where potentially you're building your own tools, detections, stuff that's very specific to your organization. So rather than just ticking boxes in an alert catalog to say, yes, this is stuff that I would like to detect, you're going and doing it that's specific to your organization. All of the ingestion stuff is geared towards how you want the data presented in your organization, how you want to work with it, what makes it smooth, what makes it effective. And then your correlations and your detections are much more effective as a result. So you're making the tools work for you rather than you having to put up with what the tools throw at you. So just to kind of cover off, this is one of the biggest areas of change that we see with an organization that really starts to focus on its threat hunting. It's moved from just taking the alerts as they come out of the system and just digging into them or ignoring them on an ad hoc basis, just choosing, well, that looks like the false positives I usually get, so I'm going to ignore it, or well, that's something a little bit different, so I'll dig into it, no idea what it is. So actually making sure that the tools are providing you with the information that you want, and that you know that when you see an alert, it's as a result of something that you've driven and you know is unique to your organization. So a few things to consider with this one. If a tool doesn't work, just move on. Not everything is going to work for your organization. Some tools just won't hit it. There may be a tool that is too simplistic, doesn't give you the quality of data that you're looking for, or indeed a tool that's too detailed for your organization where it is right now. It just gives too much information. Think about your environment. It is one big thing. It's got lots in it, and lots of stuff going on. So collect that data and analyze it according to what's happening in your organization. This is something that you'll obviously notice that we're hitting on in a number of different ways. Your situation is unique and your situation is really important. Solutions can't magically know what your environment is and how best to work with it. So doing it according to your organization, that's the best way to do it. And then the kind of more obvious stuff, think like an attacker, and as we just mentioned, it's your environment. Think like an attacker doesn't just mean, okay, a bunch of automated tools and testing, or I'll have some Nessus scanners that will just automate and just try lots of different things across the network. No attacker is just going to kind of spray and pray and hope for the best. Certainly not once they're within the network. They're going to be quietly moving around looking for what's going on and trying to find a way to go through the network without being detected. It takes us right the way back to that NSA quote at the beginning. That's their worst nightmare, is watching out for those anomalous behaviors, those weird things that are going on. And that's the stage that we're looking to get to. Okay, moving on to threat intel. Let's briefly kind of cover off where we're at with the threat intel. So threat intel is one of those really interesting things. It's often a default component of a solution, and many companies pay for that extra threat intelligence. So as a beginner, it's packaged vendor content, ad hoc procedures, intermittent, all of that kind of, yeah, we've purchased threat intelligence, we've got the package, we've deployed it, and away we go. If you look at any of the threat intelligence signatures, especially if you're running a tool like Suricata as an IDS, there can be literally tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of signatures. And it's not unusual to see customers that just have them all deployed and all turned on just because that seems to be like the right thing to do. Well, let's just turn everything on and let's just hope for the best. Because if you've got every detection turned on, then you're definitely going to detect something that's happening in the network. Well, that's absolutely true, but that's why people end up with detections that have 99.9% false positive rates, or even 100% false positive. I have worked for organizations, with organizations that have detections that have never detected a true positive, just always false positives. And you say, well, why don't you just turn it off? Because, well, it might detect a true positive one day, but imagine all of the time that's wasted looking through thousands of false positives that could be spent doing a proper threat hunt for something that's specific to your organization and isn't just well, it might happen. So yeah, that packaged vendor content can be a little bit more frustrating. So that intermediate stage, you're not just taking that packaged vendor content, you're curating it, you're looking through it, you're going, okay, well, this set of detections is relevant to my organization. That set is definitely not. It's all regularized. You know where you're going with it, you know what you're doing, but you're making a lot more sense of that threat intelligence and you're making it relevant to your organization. Finally, when you get to the advanced stage, you're actually creating content. You're thinking about, okay, what things would I be looking about that's relevant to my organization? What's the kind of, from our previous threat hunts that we've done, what have we seen? What have we identified? And then you go off and do it from there. Potentially, now this obviously isn't going to be feasible for everybody, but potentially you've got dedicated intelligence analysts that are looking into that and building on it. And as a result, you've got the governance that's working through these continuous processes and procedures to make sure that threat intelligence is as valuable as it can be for your organization and isn't just a bunch of signatures that you turned on in your detection tool. So off the back of that, you have the situation where you're hunting for specific adversaries. So this is all of this stuff starts to come together. You've seen we've mentioned it earlier on, talking about the data and the people and the processes. But this is a good example of how you can pull all that together. You start to see things, or you become aware of threat intelligence. So you pull it in and you make something of it. And this is where you're taking an alert that's new and that's relevant and that could be interesting. And off the back of it, you then create your threat intelligence, your threat hunting, all of this kind of stuff. It's all pulled together. So you're not waiting for a third party to dig into it and find out what that actually means, find out what the TTPs are, go off, build a signature. The signature is going to be pretty generic because they have to build it for every company that subscribes to their signature. But you've already gone and done it. You've understood that, for example, it relies on specific hardware types. And you know that you have those specific hardware types in 2 certain locations. So it's much more tuned, it's much more nuanced to your organization. So yeah, that's what we're talking about when we pull all of this stuff together. Okay, so finally, as I said, we briefly talk about automation. So again, automation, not something that's used extensively, but definitely something that can really add value. So when you start off in the beginning, it's repeatable hunt tasks. So this is things like saving a query. So you write a query that's relevant. It's not something that you want to be running all the time because maybe it's got a relatively high or very high false positive rate. Maybe it's just something that is going to produce nothing, but it's something that you want to do periodically to understand because the answers it brings back are interesting and relevant. So yeah, you've got your use cases developed, you know from previous success what's involved there. So you can now start to automate some of those things. Once you move to the intermediate, it's more about the scoped playbooks. So defining the kind of things that are relevant to your environment, how you can work with them and where you're going to look for them, and potentially automating some of those actions. So parts of those playbooks can be done automatically. And then you work the results, you dig further, all of that kind of stuff. And again, the success of those playbooks is evaluated, you're rotating round on that success and understanding further what you can do. And that's really where you'll move into that advanced level. You've got the matrix, potentially you've got fully automated hunts because you really know what you're doing, it's all really well defined, and the steps in those processes are well understood. So just to make it clear, this isn't just an automated detection that's running constantly. This is, you've got a very specific threat hunt that you want to do. It's a series of queries and interactions, but you've been able to automate that process so those results can come back. Okay, so just to finish off, we're going to dig down into a very recent real-world example. So this is from last week, April the 19th, and MITRE, the organisation that we referenced earlier, and I'm sure all of you have read into and looked into, they had an attack in their organisation. They kind of have gone to press with all the information and have given a huge kind of insight and feedback to help other organizations understand what happened to them and how it could be avoided in the future. Now, they've been very upfront and open and honest about it. They followed best practices and vendor instructions because they knew that they had Ivanti systems, their infrastructure. They upgraded them, replaced them, and hardened them according to the instructions that were provided, but they didn't detect that they had actually already succumbed to that 0 day, and they hadn't detected the lateral movement within their VMware infrastructure, and they basically thought that they were clear. Now, this is not in any way, shape or form a criticism of what happened or what they did or that they missed something. Obviously, they're a great organisation. This isn't the first time it's happened to them, but it's a really interesting insight into how even organisations that take the best steps can still get caught out because they missed something and didn't see something. So if we look at what happened and we dig down into the different things that they're recommending, and this is by their own admittance that these were things that they weren't doing, and these are suggestions of things that you could do so you don't end up in the same situation they did. So firstly, there's the top two that you see there, the anomaly detection and the behavior analysis. So in this case, they've talked about VPN traffic with unusual patterns, spikes in connections or unusual geographic locations. They talk about behavior analysis, so deviations in user behavior, unusual logon times, accessing unfamiliar resources. So these are classic threat hunting scenarios. They're also classic kind of detection scenarios, but they will often, if you're just turning it on as a default rule, which tends to be, it'll be pretty noisy. You'll get a lot of false positives. You just have a default detection for unusual logon times. But classic examples of that affect all three of those areas that you can see there: tools, data, and people and processes. Great scenario for how those things can be detected. And then obviously they go on to talk about threat intelligence feeds. So stay updated with threat intelligence feeds, identify known malicious IP addresses. Now, this is another good example of how just working with these things and applying some intelligence to your situation. If you don't have Ivanti systems in your environment, then clearly that's not something that you had to worry about. So you didn't have to worry about bringing in any detections or threat intelligence feeds related to that scenario. But I can tell you now that for many, many people that use all of these things here, they will have that deployed simply because it's a new set of signatures, they've turned it on, and even though they don't have any of that particular hardware in their scenario, their environment, they'll have it turned on anyway with the detections. And this is a great way of summing up the difference between the two. Just turning on pointless detections really adds no value, but understanding the impact and the things to look for and the things that were missed in this example and understanding how that relates to threat hunting. And suddenly those detections become not quite irrelevant, but become really less important because even though MITRE did everything they could around detecting that, they'd missed other things that could have been found using threat hunting techniques that would have given them those insights. Okay, so thank you for your time. I hope that's been useful and interesting, but are there any questions?
All right, thanks, Matt, for taking us through some really interesting content. And we have had some questions pop up throughout the presentation, so I'm just going to jump straight in here. Which would you recommend first, introducing new tools or assigning people to threat hunt, or something else?
Yeah, so I think that definitely for me, the starting point would be the people and the processes. I think almost every organization will have some tools in place already. I mean, everybody's got some kind of endpoint tool. Lots of people have various different logging going on, whether that's to a SIEM or not. But people typically have a good starting selection of tools that they can start to make use of. So if we think about everything we've talked about today in that beginner type approach, you can almost guarantee that there's data puddles, you've got the information. So starting to work with that is a great way of doing it, because once you started to work with it, you start to understand much more effectively the difference between the kind of the gaps, as it were. So you start to understand the difference between running a query that looks for I don't know, VPN connections out of hours, which can generate a lot of false positives, versus threat hunting with that kind of approach that says, well, okay, I'm going to limit it to this geographical area, these people, and this type of VPN connection that then also relates to connections to specific things that I wouldn't expect them to be connected to. So yeah, start with people, and then that tends to drive how you can most effectively fill those gaps.
Great, thanks. Okay, here's a good one. Aren't threat hunts just detections?
Yeah, that's something that is really difficult and really nuanced, because yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, they're, on the face of it, the two are the same thing. Threat hunting is just running a query that generates a response. I think the difference between the two is not just the way that you use them, but also the thinking behind it. So when you start with an alert catalog or a detection catalog or threat intelligence, as we've been talking about, really what you have is a very generic detection. And I think anybody here who's an analyst or has worked in security will have seen that situation where there's a detection in place and just constantly generates false positives, because it's too generic. It's too it's based around a TTP that is kind of so close to something that happens every day. So we see that a lot. You can't help but see it, where, especially in those organizations where it's just a case of, well, let's turn everything on, because it's better to have a true positive buried somewhere in the data, that we'll hopefully eventually dig out. But I can tell a story that one of my previous organizations, I won't say which one, I was working with a customer that had a SOC, and I was actually working with an analyst, and looking at their day-to-day and what they were doing. And I watched as this guy selected a list. So he filtered for a particular detection, and he selected about 500 alerts and just deleted them. And I kind of said, wow, that was pretty brave. And he said, yeah, but that's what we've had in the last 30 seconds. And it would be ridiculous to think that I could do anything with them. And as part of that overall exercise, we calculated that on average, the analyst had 7 seconds per alert to look at the alert and make a decision as to whether they was going to go into it and work with it. Now, that's 7 seconds just to look at the alert in the list. They clicked on an alert, every 7 seconds they were behind by another alert that they'd missed, another alert that they'd missed, another alert that they'd missed. So those alerts were backlogging. So that's an impossible scenario to be in. And that's, when we talk about analyst burnout and all the rest of it, that's where your queries are letting you down. That's not the way to do it. Threat hunting is very different. Threat hunting is where you, as I say, you're not just being a slave to the alert engine. You're saying that query is utterly pointless because it generates a volume of false positives that's meaningless. I'm going to do this differently. I know my network. I know what's important. I know the quirks. I know what's normal. So I'm going to work within that. And today I'm going to focus on certificates. Tomorrow I'm going to focus on remote access. The day after I'm going to focus on applications, whatever it might be. It's a different mindset.
Yeah. Okay, and probably the last one I think we'll have time for. How long does it take an organization to move to doing threat hunting rather than detection-based SOC analysis?
Yeah, that's a good one. It does vary, and I think that a lot of it comes down to where you're coming from and what you're actually solving for. It's really interesting how we will talk to organizations and they'll really want to move to threat hunting, and they'll really want to enrich their data, for example, and they'll be saying, yeah, we're going to bring in an NDR tool and we're going to combine it with our endpoint data and we're going to do all of this stuff. And they say, all right, that sounds fantastic. Let's do a POC, let's do a POV. And then they go, great. And so they get it on site. And then the first thing that they do as part of the POV is they say, right, we're going to turn on everything in the alert catalog and we're going to do a bunch of testing. and you kind of go, well, okay, well, that's complete opposite of what threat hunting is meant to be. And you've kind of just demonstrated that maybe you're not there with that security maturity. So I think probably more than trying to put a time on it is think more about what you need to do and how you're going to get there. And just, I keep talking about mindset and how important that is for or what you're solving for, however you want to couch it. But it's really that thing of think about where you want to get to, what's the most effective way to get there, and what are the steps that I need to do to take it, and just try not to fall back to the comfort of, well, let's just test everything and let's let the tool do the hard work, because that tends not to work particularly well.
Absolutely. Okay, I think we're just about out of time now, so I'm going to go ahead and close this out. Thanks again, Matt, for the presentation today. We do have another webinar coming up on the 21st of May, and you can register for that one now, and we will send the link in an email along with your recording. And with that, thank you very much for joining, and we hope to see you all next time.